Well, I will get started. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Victoria Verge, and I am the Education Coordinator of Adult Programming here at the Kelowna Art Gallery. On behalf of the Board of Directors and staff, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. And I'll begin this evening's talk by acknowledging that the land on which the gallery stands is the unceded traditional territory of the Okanagan Silks people. Tonight, we are joined by Dr. Anna Hudson. She's joining us from her home in Ontario right now, and I just want to first say thank you so much for adapting to the time difference and for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be a part of this series. Dr. Hudson is the second speaker in our Northern Pine lecture series, which is organized in conjunction with our current exhibition, Northern Pine, Watercolours and Drawings by the Group of Seven from the McMichael Canadian Art Collection. Professor Anna Hudson is an art historian and a curator specializing in Canadian and Indigenous art at York University in Toronto. She is currently a York Research Chair leading Mobilizing Inuit Cultural Heritage, a social sciences and humanities research council of Canada research creation collaboration aimed at facilitating and disseminating Inuit knowledge, culture, and creativity. I just have a few housekeeping rules before we get started, and I turn it over to Anna. We ask that you please save all of your questions until the end of the talk, when we will have a 15-minute Q&A session. I will try my best, as always, to get to as many of your questions as possible. Please type these questions into the chat bar and ensure that your settings are set to message all panelists and not on private. I must also mention that today's talk will be recorded and available for future viewing on our website. So be sure to mute your microphone, turn off your cameras, and enjoy the talk. Thank you so much, and take it away, Anna.
Thank you so much, Victoria. It's been a real pleasure to get to know you and to be in Kelowna tonight. Thank you so much. I'm going to talk about work that I did for my doctoral dissertation, and then have continued to work on subsequently. So I've got kind of two sides, doing 20th century Canadian art, and then doing Indigenous and specifically work on Inuit art. And it's a welcome return, actually, to that earlier area that I'm so fond of. I'm going to do a share screen now, Victoria, and I'm going to put on my PowerPoint here. Okay, here we go. Great. Okay. Depression era and wartime art and social consciousness, the legacy of the Group of Seven. Probably you're familiar with the work on the left there, Tom Thompson's Jack Pine. That's the large painting. I mean, Tom Thompson did stunning sketches and then the odd large canvas, fewer large canvases in his sketches. And this is the one in the National Gallery of Canada from 1916-17. On the right is Paraskeva Clark, and it's her image Petrushka from 1937. And it's this juxtaposition of images of a group of seven and then a next generation painter, a leading figure within the Canadian group of painters, that group that formed subsequent to the dissolution of the Group of Seven. And I want you just to keep these two images in mind as we move forward. So Paraskeva Clark marries a Canadian, comes to Toronto of all things. She'd been trained in St. Petersburg. She was a modernist. She was cosmopolitan, and she marries an accountant and comes to live in what was then really a very small Toronto scene. But that scene had been, long active, really. I mean, the Ontario Society of Artists formed in 1872. The Ontario College of Art was active. There was the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts in 1880, but relative to Europe, Canada seemed really tiny. But Canada was engaged, And soon Paraskeva Clark found her a rewarding home here. What's interesting, if you just look at the top there, I want to get my see this little tree that comes out there. And in earlier sketches for this, as other art historians have revealed, she had a variation of a group of 7 tree or a Tom Thompson kind of jack pine there. And here now we see this busy urban developed environment, something perhaps more of a memory of St. Petersburg for her than of Toronto. And we've got this theater stage, this theater stage coming up in the center, and that dead tree comes out of the back of a collusion of capital and political power. So you can see that Paraskeva Clark was leftist leaning. In fact, she was a communist, although many artists were left leaning at this time. Few were ready to suggest that they were communist in orientation, basically because that was against the law. So the more were likely to say they were members of the League for Social Reconstruction, but they might only whisper it. So there was a strong kind of leftist sentiment among artists. And you can see here what that really was about, because it was, all right, here we have the arts coming up in this busy urban setting. We've got this crowd around this theater production that is criticizing the collusion of capital and political power. That group of 7 gorgeous tree, or the Thompson tree that preceded the group of 7, is dead. It's, it just died in this urban environment. And that poor little worker, these are little marionettes, right? That poor little worker is being beaten down and hangs over the platform there. And this crowd is lifting up and cheering. And that fist that is raised, that's the fist of the Popular Front, which was support of the left in, European politics at the time. Paraskeva Clark appears to the left there with her baby son, Clive, and her older son, Ben, who's a little further down there. And we see this figure of the multi-arts figure here, this character who looks at us and points upwards. This is a kind of admonishing figure that was a feature of Western art historical painting. If you think of Renaissance painting or Baroque painting, there would be often a figure who would catch you in and say, look, this is really important, what's going on here, pay attention. What's interesting too is that these tenements rise up, they're like curtains being pulled to the side, and the whole painting is a mix of the arts, of theater, of music, of and of audience and engagement in contemporary life. So this is very different than what the group of 7 were doing, although she references the group directly, as I mentioned. She references particularly the importance of the tree. And she's commenting on current events. The Spanish Civil War began in 1936, and it was the first signal of like the inevitability of the Second World War to come. And she also pasted on the back of the canvas the brutal beating down of strikers at the Republic Steel Corporation in Chicago, and how this was an evidence of police brutality or government brutality against the worker. And ultimately, what we're going to see is that the artist identified with the worker, and that becomes increasingly apparent. So this is another image just on its own of that Tom Thompson's image of the tree. Suddenly there's 2 images, right? The jack pine and the west wind. So this is the jack pine. And, you could see that this is a large canvas. You can see that Thompson is immersed in an attempt to translate the beauty of that scene into the language of painting. So you've got kind of like a pointillist or, you know, techniques mixed with expressionist or Fauvist techniques. It's sort of a study of various European styles of modern painting in order to capture the unique character of all the elements, the sky, the rock, the tree, the water. And it's very much a kind of, you know, one self and the universe, the self and wilderness, as Thompson was an isolated painter and, you know, in his travels. So different from the kind of view of nature that Parasceva Clark did. This is just 1 year prior to Petrushka, and it's one of her wheat field paintings from 1936. And here we see these rolling wheat fields of, you know, southern Ontario, pardon me. And we see the you know, the rural farm buildings, the barn nestled tightly and cozily in the landscape. And we see a rolling field that is rolling landscape that's very much cultivated, and not scary and by any means, but not sublime the way that Jack Pine was either. It's a cultivated or civilized landscape. It's the tamed landscape. It's the landscape in which society lives in harmony with nature. You know, there's a sense of a wanting to describe something about humanity and the environment and nature that then, with the, you know, onset of the Spanish Civil War and the issues of striker and worker violence, remember that was the 1930s, undergoing the economic depression, so there were many people out of work and difficult economic circumstances, you know, and yet she's also painting images like this about harmony. What really struck me was how much she was creating a kind of language. This is her good friend Carl Schaefer, a Wheatfield 1936, same year, shown in the same Canadian group of painters exhibitions. And similar kind of interest in the neat stacking of that wheat, the way that the farmer handles that landscape, the craft of farming, and you know, the yield that one can create, the sustenance one provides. Charles Comfort, another character in all of these, you know, we've got a couple of names that we're going to hear over and over. And this is a Charles Comfort painting of Carl Schaefer. They were all in Toronto, all became important colleagues and friends, all developing an artistic language together. So that's what I became very interested in. I mean, the group of seven does of sorts create a language. I mean, it's a language of a relationship with nature, and, you know, one could say that they developed a nationalist landscape aesthetic, but the painters that came after them, the painters who the group of seven encouraged when they disbanded and formed the Canadian group of painters, and they brought them along, and they stayed as kind of mentoring figures within that group. These were the artists that created, like, what a critic of the period, Robert Eyre, called slogans or symbols. He was perhaps critical of it, that you would have, you know, again, references to wheat fields, references to buildings and landscape. And here's Carl Schaefer. He's in the wheat field. He's got his paint box open. We see his hands. I'm curious, you know, I think it's really interesting that he emphasizes the hands, the craft, the making. And Schaefer, deep in thought. Schaefer was from Hanover, Ontario. And many, many years ago now, I remember meeting with his son and saying how his father, Carl, used to admire the craft of those furrows after the farmer had gone through for planting in the spring. Back and forth a bit here. Tom Thompson, I mean, he really excels in his sketches. And look at this incredible nighttime scene in Algonquin Park where we see the aurora borealis. So there's something about this engagement with the universe, of how the world functions. I was always intrigued by this painting, and, you know, in It falls really closely on the heels of pretty mesmerizing discoveries in science, of Max Planck and Albert Einstein, of theories of relativity and quantum physics. And Tom Thompson's brother, in fact, was a scientist, and no doubt Tom would have known it through his brother, known of these discoveries through his brother. And sort of seeing this energy, this molecular dance of the universe, and how the molecules function together. And, it's just it's a tiny little thing, but it's just gorgeous and filled with this, incredible kind of imagining of our molecular integration with one another in the environment. He was a very, my thesis supervisor was Dennis Reed, the artist, well-known Canadian art historian. And Dennis used to describe Thompson as retinal. And I think he's right. Right here you see this, again, a small sketch of his tent, in Algonquin Park where he was painting. And it is incredibly visually present and punctuated. So he was a seer, right? That, he was seeing, looking, observing. And, and I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind, like the idea of the artist as observer, the artist as seer, and this is the West Wind. So this is the West Wind, which is 1917 in the Art Gallery of Ontario, and we saw Jack Pine in the National Gallery. So it's like a fun, competition between who has the, the best Tom Thompson major canvas. But again, you see every kind of style, very Fauve, very Art Deco or Art Nouveau, rather, versus Expressionist, versus, all sorts of ways of approaching this kind of, almost as if, a different painting style would suggest the molecular character of each of those elements. As he's trying to push his painting really hard in a modernist direction, a modernism that was informed by new knowledges of nature and of the world, and of his immense admiration for the beauty of nature. And these become intensely symbolic for Canada, not so much because of an exchange of imagery between artists, the way that the subsequent generation did, but lots of the ways that the group, Tom Thompson and the Group of Seven, has been written about in the past. Although, as I'll like to suggest, wartime propaganda played a very important role in this also. Thinking about these, canonical greats of the Group of Seven work, this is North Shore Lake Superior from 1926, but by which time Tom Thompson was long past. And Lauren Harris, again, something transformative, something, mesmerizing, something very theosophical in terms of like all of the spiritualisms that, as major religions were challenged at the turn of the 20th century. We have, artists and many others picking up various spiritualisms, theosophy being one of them. And basically the idea would be that you could find the logic of the universe if you looked in nature. And that logic was, in the theosophical perspective, verticals and horizontal, male, female, but all of them uniting. There was a kind of a sexual reference there, that there was a uniting of the male and female elements of the universe that created perfect harmony. We're going, back in time. All of these kind of, they do seem kind of dated now, but this tremendous. Even though this is a dead tree, it's solid. It's poignant, and that ray of light over Lake Superior tells us there's a greater meaning here. So different again, back to Paris Gava Clark's Wheatfield and Carl Schaefer's Wheatfield, where there's something different going on. It's not, if Lauren Harris and Tom Thompson are going past the human, Carl Schaefer and Paris Gava Clark are insisting or suggesting here that there's something really, really important about the human. Let's not go past the human, let's think about the human. And I think that had something to do with the fact that they were mid-depression and the conflicts in the global world were edging towards world war. Everybody knew it. especially with the Spanish Civil War. And, so we think back to like, well, how come this, legacy of the group, sorry, some of my papers just fell off. The legacy of the group was, I think, primarily a recognition of the power of art to say something, the importance of art for society, and the fact that the artist had to be a vital member of national life. And this subsequent generation took it to this other level, thinking, okay, it's humans creating this problem. Humans have this opportunity. Let's focus on the human. 1937, the year of Petrushka, Carl Schaefer does Storm Over Fields. So a completely, different view of like, oh boy, right here we have those, harmonious, lived in, cultivated landscapes, and something's brewing, something's coming in, and it's going to threaten to destroy it. The Canadian Group of Painters was a loose organization, national in reach and longevity. In the first 1933 catalog, Arthur Lismer wrote the beginning to say that its purpose was to extend the creative faculty beyond the professional meaning of art and to make of it a more common language of expression, with figures and portraits beginning to strengthen and occupy the background of landscape. So there was this idea that he acknowledged, a member of a group, Arthur Lismer, acknowledging that it was the human entering what the Group of Seven had established as a kind of wilderness imaginary of the nation. Again, if this is showing great optimism, Storm Over Fields and other works is showing concern. And I'm jumping, sorry this isn't a fantastic for resolution, but this is Charles Comfort again, the one who did Young Canadian, that image, 1932 image of Carl Schaefer sitting in the farm field. And this is Charles Comfort's 1944 Hitler line. So he was sent to Italy in the Second World War. Artists, there was the Canadian War artists established, were artists as seers, as observers, continuing that legacy of the group. We're going to join battalions in the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Carl Schaefer joined, others joined. Paris Cava-Clark did, stayed at home in Canada, but she did women's work, Canadian Women's Army Corps. And here we see, going back, here we see that blasted. So here you've got what was that symbol of hope destroyed, and we see, it's got this actual metal shard sticking out, and then we see the soldiers coming in. We see something about, a reference to military organization, human ability, human destructibility, but there's something that, clearly a playing with image, this language, the idea of sharing language. So sharing the tree, sharing the field, sharing, what do these all mean? And what's so interesting is that from the turn of this 20th century forward comes the development of psychology as a discipline. So the idea that you start inquiries, think of Sigmund Freud at the turn of the century, but, that figuring out how the human mind worked. And at the same time that there was a figuring out how the human mind worked, you have, science blowing open with theories of relativity and quantum physics, which, were like, wow, a molecule doesn't stay in one spot all the time, and energy levels fluctuate. We don't really know how the mind works and how consciousness functions. But clearly, alongside all of that, with the development of advertising and photography and so forth, something happened. And that was that artists began to see that they played a role in the battle over minds. That the Second World War, given Hitler or fascism and Nazism, was the convincing of people of certain points of view, and the ability to have people lose their lives and lose everything for a cause. And that the Second World War was a battle also very much fought on the cultural front, and that artists saw their place in very important place in that battle for the mind, in the battle for understanding and revealing how the mind works, and in playing a part in it. Imagine, a painter thinking they can play a part in war, that a painter is a soldier. I think we've gone so far away from that now. I think we're probably at a moment, though, where we're, this is coming back. It will come back as a conviction. I mean, ultimately, the group of 7 members, along with the Canadian group of painters, younger generation, these were the artists that insisted not only that there be a Canadian war art program for the Second World War, and arguing you have to do it. You have to send these artists, managing to convince, imagine, government to do it, but ultimately were successful in creating the Canada Council. So the Canada Council for the Arts in Canada forms in 1957. It comes out of the 1949 Royal Commission that Vincent Massey was important part of. Vincent Massey being, very important advocate of the arts in Canada. So, a moment was like where there was this gathering of support for artists at a time of economic depression and world war that ultimately led to those bodies that support the arts ongoing in Canada and distinguish us more along the lines of the UK and very much different from the United States, which doesn't have the same kind of support for the arts that artists and cultural institutions in Canada has. This is another comfort painting. It's the Canadian armor passing through Ortona. So he was stationed with the army in Italy. And what a poignant place to be stationed, right? Because you were seeing, the very much kind of sense of, if the artists began to think about how they exchanged iconography, like similar images, this means this means that, and they develop a Canadian iconography of wheat fields, of trees, of this and that. There was a long history of iconography in Western art history, including those that we see in churches and architecture in Europe. And here, this tank, this Canadian armor passing through a cultural landscape that's been destroyed. And you see, again, an admonishing figure here. If you look right down at the bottom, this is a little putti, right? These little cupidity baby angel-y thingies, for lack of a better term. And that little putti is looking back at us and saying, hey, look what's going on. Culture is being destroyed. What's going to replace it? Because, rightly so, it's like, what culture do we share is what connects us, what creates our shared values, which makes Canada a very difficult place, right? Because it's hard, just a little aside, right? There's so many cultures here. But it's the idea of culture being a place where your values are set. And those values in this period of time for artists like Comfort were very much around the relationship of culture to democracy, and really to Judeo-Christian values of operating society in a seamless and responsible way. And this horrible pile of destroyed art and culture that's meant to alarm us to the future. Artists were employed as propagandists, all of this in recognition that, the advertising industry had already boomed. It only boomed in, the Second World War just tripped it into hypergear. And we see these tremendous images that are meant to encourage, again, the battle for the minds, the battle on the culture front. Here we see, Canada's alliance to Great Britain and the threat of the UK to look at this the shadow, right? It's like, and then it turns into this scary kind of, arm and you see all these ships going, and this, you know, Paul Bunyan-y kind of Canadian Paul Bunyan, I guess, just stepping over this giant to address the problem. And look at this stunning Quebec town, Tadasak. This is Charles Comfort's 1935 painting of Tadasak. And, you know, that he would be, it was a vacation place, really. And he would drive it, you know, come up to the ridge and see it, and typical Quebec town with this church at the center. And it's idyllic. Again, it's like those wheat fields from the mid-30s. It's an organized, tightly knitted town, where, you know, the structure in harmony, nestled in the landscape. And it's a revelatory view, right, of a kind of the human and the social, the spiritual, and the role of art in underscoring those values. So just, you know, in mid-Depression, prior to his Hitler line painting. This is the 1937 World's Fair. So if you think about what's happening globally, here we have the Soviet Pavilion right opposite the Nazi Pavilion. So you think of a World's Fair that were meant to be, you know, all the nation states are coming in there to basically say, look how great we are, this is what we're doing. You know, and it's really tied to economic power. Here it's become intensely political. 2 years later, the Second World War would begin. And you could see the extent to which art, propaganda, the understanding or appreciation of the psychological power of art and how you do that. So that, you know, in the top of the Soviet Pavilion is the woman and the man, the farmer and the industrial worker in hand. And then you know, you can't see it here, but you've got the eagle at the top there, the Nazi Pavilion, and at the bottom here, you've got these larger than life Olympian figures, these, you know, incredible, like that Canadian giant saying, lick them over there, you know, these kind of incredible athletes. And so it's just a kind of, you know, we never come back to this, probably for good reason, because this was such a pitched moment of a manipulation and the role of art in doing that. At the same time, the exploration, the value of art for society was never higher, you know, in the terms of the role the artist could play. Which brings us back to Paris Gable-Clark and the 1937 Petrushka and what must have been going through her mind. And the kind of, this is a 1922 Soviet poster. You know, so you can really see how quickly, from the late 19th through early 20th centuries, certain languages were being developed. You know, you have the cowering Uncle Sam and the communist worker going to stomp out all of these, you know, political leaders. And you've got the factory, you know, the kind of mnemonic of the worker being the factory. Bertram Brooker, this is his image of Recluse from 1939. An interesting image from that year, but look at the similarity from Petrushka of that kind of theater set of, you know, he very early on in Manitoba, before he moved to Toronto, he and his brother ran a cinema. So a lot of his works have these kind of like that opening moment of in the old times where, you know, the curtains had to open and then the projection would begin in a very theatrical fashion. And here is this, you know, shifting or a figure, you know, the worker alone, and the kind of the proliferation of the kind of worker figures in cities like Toronto and everywhere else in the 1930s. living in rooming houses, eating in, out all the time, not having a very pleasant urban experience. And it's interesting, you see these telegraph poles on the sidewalk. There was an interesting movement, and it's been very little discussed. But this shift to being interest in the human. We've got a return to humanism, which was very much of the Renaissance. It's about humanity's potential. There's been a lot of criticism of humanism. Are we post-human now? Do we realize, I think there's probably not been enough to really investigate what this humanism meant at this period in time. It was a humanism inspired by science, the science I was discussing. It was a scientific humanism that thought about the relativity of human relativity, the way that humans bounce off one another and affect one another. And, just like atoms, but, and the importance of understanding culture and the arts and in that. And what was propelling this concern, which was only written about minimally, this scientific humanism angle, which I've been interested in, was mass communication. So, the radio, ultimately later television, photography, advertising, newspapers, that there was this barrage of information. And if we weren't careful, it wasn't going to be held in check. And what you end up with is this world is kind of careening out of control. Feels a bit coronavirus-y right at the moment. These images that focus us on the human, the forgotten, the unnamed, the recluse, and that toll that all of this, modernization was taking on society. I was including this just these are Lenin images of, again, just thinking about, appealing to the masses from a different position, and, politics, leftist politics versus the growth of capitalism, and why this became such a pitch in the early 20th century, how to get people's attention, how to move it away from mass media to something more grassroots, and ultimately a game that Hitler excelled at. This is at the 1937 Paris World's Fair, and it's the Spanish Pavilion, so, right, the Spanish Civil War. And this is an enormous painting, Pablo Picasso's Guernica. And the story of Guernica, right, that it was a Basque town, had nothing of importance in it except it was one of those lovely communities like Tadasak, or, there was wonderful farm in the wheat fields. It was this old community that housed archives and a Spanish language different from Madrid. And it was bombed. And so bombed by, proto-Nazi forces. And here's really interesting, the approach that Pablo Picasso takes. So we would look really small in this, this is really large. It's because it's a collage, right? It's a collage of newspaper clippings, essentially. And so he's taking mass media and he's playing with it in the language of painting, of monumental painting, of the kind of monumental painting that developed during the Renaissance and the Baroque, and this is like a Sistine ceiling turned on its, on the vertical, to impress upon the moment that what the newspapers is recording is a great human and cultural tragedy. Here we have, various tropes of, this eye, this light of revelation, of the dead soldier, of the mother and the dead child. And it's sort of an awakening to, hey, look at the power of the arts that was global in nature, and poignant. I mean, there's been lots of writing about the emergence of photography, and the relationship of photography to painting, because they were at odds at this point. I mean, what was as going back to, amazing that there was insistence that there be a Canadian war art program. And, Picasso in painting on this scale was insisting on something special about painting. And the philosopher, Walter Benjamin, there's a very famous article called The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction that he published in 1936. And it said there's something powerful there's an aura of painting. It's timeless, it's timelessness. The fact that it speaks across centuries in the history of painting and Western art and culture that can outperform the photograph. So there's a tremendous optimism of the ability of the painter to outperform, and for that painting to have intense social, cultural, and spiritual impact. This is the outskirts of that pavilion, Spanish Pavilion. You see it references photography and included newspaper clippings and elements, so it's very much addressing this relationship. Another view of that, tremendous, the locking in of the two countries that would lead into the war. And another propaganda image: every Canadian must fight, shoulder to shoulder. And this is a Philip Surrey, Quebec painter of the generation of the Canadian group of painters. So we're going well past now the moment in 1936 where the opening introduction to that catalog for the 1936 Canadian Group of Painter exhibition. Arthur Lismer says again, the newer members offer lively interpretations in the spirit of newer ideas that move the painter into creative action. Getting creative action and what that would entail in the years to come. Okay, back to the North Shore, Lake Superior, Lauren Harris, 1926. Bertram Brooker and how artists were thinking about the tree. This is his green movement from the 1920s. Figures in a Landscape, Bertram Brooker, 1931, a lost painter thinking about the tree and the body and how they were one and the same. Thinking about that North Shore, Lake Superior, and that Canadian soldier, the tree, west wind, able to flex at the ebb and flow, and gusts of wind, and in the Precambrian shield, and ultimately in 1941, Bertram Brooker does Pygmalion's Miracle. So the miracle, right, of the sculptor who creates a woman, and she comes to life, and they become lovers. And here is this female body, right? Reminds us of images of Greco-Roman sculpture, Renaissance sculpture, of that sculpture coming to life, that art comes to life. And again, those curtains opening as the stone becomes pink, and all the talk of the period about the end of civilization, the loss of one's own country and place. Charles Comfort, Primavera, 1942. So he's the same guy that did the Canadian armor passing through Ortona and the Hitler line. Here we've got a reclining Venus in the Tuscan landscape, essentially, with olive trees, and she's sort of vaguely what we're disturbing her. She's pretty close to looking like stone. She's only a bit pink, really. And we've got these tanks coming in. So, the sculpture coming to life. Thinking of Florence Weil, one of the sculptors of the Group of Seven's generation, really. This is from 1937, Torso, that that body, that female body, the generative body, the body that, you know, gives birth. And yet it stands like the North Shore Lake Superior, you know, a burnt out tree. And a little back here to the catalog of the Northern Pine catalog. And I was thinking, Victoria, you know, that those sketches remind us that of the training of members of academic training. Look at this incredible academic model, right, of the training of the members of the group had in anatomical accuracy, in learning to develop as an artist by painting and drawing from the model, the live model. And so the sketches in that Northern Pine catalog tell us this story that I'm telling you, that we can't think of the group as wilderness landscape nation painters altogether, although, you know, their wilderness paintings were reproduced in silk screens and put in barracks for soldiers to remember home in Canada and overseas. So there was, you know, the replication of those images, their multiplication of those images happened during the Second World War, first and foremost, you know, the mass production of that imaginary Canadianness. But this is Carmichael, if I'm not mistaken. And you just see, wow, he was a beautiful painter of the human body. And Fred Varley, you know, his affair with Vera, clearly that affair is active here. That is a loving, beautiful image of intimacy, you know, and that idea of the intimate relationship with nature, and then the intimate nature with humanity, that there was this very human expression that was happening. And how charming is MacDonald's drawing of his newborn son, Thoreau. So that other side comes through so beautifully in the Northern Pine catalog, and makes it one of the reasons that makes it such an important catalog. So you see this sensitivity that the artists knew, right? The artists across generations understood. And another Carmichael image here, just of a mining town, right? That it wasn't just all theoretically unspoilt wilderness. I'm going back to Carmichael. I'm getting conscious of time. So what I want to do is just to see if I can drive us home here, and thinking about other kinds of images that, you know, began to be produced in the late 30s and 40s. And this is a Louis Molstock, who we normally think of as doing figure images, you know, these doorways. And this one I always really love, Jack Bush, right? Abstract painter. We think of him as purely abstract, large scale, but he had this very interesting representational painting style. So, you know, you think of, okay, group was representational, so was the Canadian group of painters members, and especially a socially conscious group of artists in Toronto and Montreal during the 30s and 40s. And, you know, this is 1947, it's called Yesterday. And it graced the cover of the 1947 issue of Saturday Night Weekly, important magazine in Toronto and beyond. You know, and it was a poem by Harold Caverhill. I feel an echoing emptiness through doorways roll in this hollow shell of yesterday without a soul. And it's very much post-war. It's like, oh God, right? What are we going to do now? Do we still believe in the power of art? Do we still believe what's happening, right? So that Guernica statement, you know, that Petrushka punch, you know, where are we now, where we just amble through these representational paintings that are very observant and very cognizant of a kind of that urban existence of, you know, where do we turn to next for our spiritual direction? If humanity has failed us, I think it was the end of humanism right here, right? Because it was a slam to humanism, because humanity nearly destroyed itself, and by this point there was the atomic bomb, of course, and you know the idea that you could just blow up the world was pretty worrying. And you know, I just want to flag in the last 5 minutes, if that's okay, Victoria. You know, just this image of, this is a Conrad Poirier, and he's a not very well known Montreal photographer, doing photography for newspapers. Instead of being drawing for newspaper illustration, it was, all photographs. But look at this, Montreal newsstand, mid-30s. And look at how it's full of like women and then strength, the men, physique and burlesque and populaire and fashion and avance des allées, right? And so it's just a very interesting snapshot of competing notions of what means what does this iconography mean anymore. I'm thinking of Baker, the well-known dancer from the US who went to France and never left, and this was her banana skirt. She did the Madonna dance in 1927. This is York Wilson before he became an abstract painter. Backstage, 1946, a burlesque house in Toronto, and what the body began to mean. But even in the wartime, this is a First World War painting by Jeffries, C.W. Jeffries, who we know for images illustration of Canadian history. This is his painting. Let me find it here, of Polish army bathing at Camp Niagara from 1919. And just like when I was working with a Quebec curator on the nude exhibition, the gang des nudes, we called it, like the bodies, in wartime, that just changed the notion of the body at the same time as the populations of urban centers, and then the development of the sex industry and the skin trade and the way that photography played in that. This is from 1894, and then from 1939, the body, the physique, so interesting. And I'll probably just show about 3 more images. This is a painting by an artist whose name's gone right out of my head. It's from 1945, excuse me. And it's by an artist who's otherwise very little known, and I'll try to find it before we are done. Gordy Weber, I think it is. Hang on here. That's just killing me. Anyway, what's interesting here is that we have a different kind of perception of the moment. And if photography can show us one sense of the immediate, there's a sense here that we can get another in this yesterday's newspaper, at the diner, the ice cream's melting, his cigarette's lit, he's the waiter or the person behind the counter whistling. So of all of these sensations happening, and an invitation to us to be aware of all of those sensations in our, physically in our body, to be aware, to be in our body, and to understand how much we as human beings, and this is the relativity of human relativity, how much we live by reading images and narrating and then making sense of them. It's William Winter is the artist, excuse me, William Winter. Midnight at Charlie's, 1945. And ultimately, we think about the artists and critics of this period and how they were trying to establish the importance of the painter as an observer. It's because that painter would help us to understand how our mind functions, that we make sense of the world constantly and instantly by telling stories. Oh, that means that we tried to create logic out of everything. And that's what the artist was doing. And I was just going to show these other images of photography, of how there was a proximity of photography and painting, but they feel different. They feel different, but in the history of the nude that plays part of this, there's a complication of the kind of cheesecakey nude paintings too. And ultimately in the history of Western art, Manet's Olympia, She's a prostitute. You have to pay for her to raise her hand away. At Titian's Venus of Urbino. Ultimately, back to Pygmalion. And to the history of still life. And I'll stop on this last one. This is the last Paris gave a Clark. And it's a strange one. It's called The Necessities of Life from 1947. And it was right at that point where artists were going to abandon representational painting and the way that representational painting put things together for you to read. Okay, there's the vase, there's the candle, there's the butterfly, there's Ezra Pound's cantos, and it's canto 27, and there's a loaf of bread. You know, so we think of the history of Western art and still life painting and how we're going to read the iconography, but we're going to read the iconography for 1947 for an artist who's living in Toronto, who's a Russian emigre, and Ezra Pound's Cantos 27 critiques the Russian Revolution. And it's one of those paintings that sort of, you know, the necessities of life, and yet the profoundness of it is gone, right? There's a flatness here. There's certainly no flatness in the power of representation to express post-war, you know, the post-war circumstance. But it's right at this point where she basically abandons representational painting and tries to become abstract. The center of painting moves from Paris to New York. Abstract expressionism, you know, and the most sort of refined of it, where it's just lines and just black and white, emerges as there's an attempt to abandon the role of painting in the battle for minds, and it becomes something else completely. And probably on that note, I should stop. Thank you for listening to me. I suspect it might have just gone on a bit too long, for which I apologize, but I really appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was fantastic. I certainly learned a lot. So now I would like to open up to our attendees. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat bar, and I will ask them to Anna, and we'll go from there. We're getting a lot of thank yous, which is lovely.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I do have a question, or maybe a little bit of an in-depth chat we could have about what you were just talking about. To do with Paris Gable Clark, do you feel that the group of seven, when they disbanded and they opened up the group of the Canadian group of painters, do you think she was one of the ones who was able to show more of a female perspective, and that Canadian female perspective? Because I did notice in her work, when you talked about that human connection and that human quality that she's bringing into her paintings, I feel like that's maybe a very female thing to want to do as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and there's a very well-known portrait from 1933. It's a self-portrait, and she's standing in a doorway. Again, that liminal space, right, of the doorway that becomes a kind of repeated image. And she's pregnant with her son, Clive. And you can just barely see. And I think that's really interesting, right, because and the fact that she includes her children in images. I think she, you know, yes, the thing about the women in particular was that they often painted inside their homes. So it was less really about, at this point in history, I think, it wasn't really about that they couldn't go out, right? Because women were very present and, you know, obviously, but it was about the importance of the domestic environment. And it was like, that's what's been, you know, why does it matter? What really matters, how I organize my space. There's so much information that I can give to you when you come into my house and see what I have. and see how it's organized and see what I value. Yeah, so there's a you don't see very many men doing that. Although you see someone like Lemoyne Fitzgerald, painting in his backyard a lot and painting, around his house. Or you do see a little bit in David Milne, interestingly enough, that he'll do these still lifes of flowers and things like that inside his cabin. But there is something concerted about it, that your lived environment, particularly women looking out their window, looking at their kitchen table, that becomes just as important as anything else. So that becomes the Aurora Borealis, right, of Tom Thompson's sketch. So you're right, yes.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I have a question here from Nancy. She says, did Clark give up on politics after witnessing the horrors of a world war? Did she isolate herself?
That's a really good question. And Peresceva Clark's confusing, right? Because she does produce in the 40s a very group of 70 paintings. And I think now that you ask that, that's an interesting insight that, she and a couple of artists, they have some fights in the art press, like, do you become a full-on propagandist, or what do you do? And, none of them wanted to be outright political really in their work. It's this very subtext, right, of the reading the imagery, reading it in the context, social context. And I think that probably what she witnessed in terms of cultural propaganda in the Second World War did put her off. And I think that's where, ultimately she has the Necessities of Life, and just like she opens to the cantos, and it's like, the Russian Revolution. Yes, I think that, that's another kind of interesting question in terms of how do people feel after a world war ends. And I think that, there's great relief, but the rebuilding is intense. The scarring is intense. The loss is palpable. And it takes, at least a decade or more, later 50s, 60s, to kind of get back to kind of a level of optimism and a kind of, I often think it's really interesting that, Peresceva's, the generation that follows Peresceva Clark, right, or who are the 60s painters. And, then there's a whole other kind of, I don't know, there's a level, and I hesitate to use the word, but there's a level of escapism that comes with art and culture in the 60s, that certainly the escapism was not there in the 30s and 40s, but perhaps it was inevitable.
Wonderful. No, yeah, that's great. I have a comment here from Sandra. She says, I met a man in Ottawa who was a World War II artist and knew Varley. You may like to know about him as he was military, Princess Patricia, and studied at Oxford. His son and family tried to sell his artwork in a commercial gallery, as it was considered to be a conflict of interest while he was working for the government. His name was Patrick Haldorson.
Oh, I'll have to look him up, because Charles Comfort did some paintings of the Princess Patricia. There's some really wonderful watercolors where you see the men under the netting in the field. Yeah, interesting. I'm gonna look that up. If anything, I'll
have to look that up too. My dad was Princess Patricia. Yeah.
There we go. Really important.
You made a couple of connections there, Sandra. Thank you. Okay. I'm not seeing too many more questions. And we're about 10 after 7. Fantastic talk, Anna. Thank you so much. Very interesting. I think we all learned a lot. And again, thank you for joining us so late back where you are.
No problem. It was really a pleasure, and thank you all, and a big thanks to the Kelowna Art Gallery and to Victoria.
Well, thanks again. And for anybody who is here in Kelowna, be sure to stop by and check out the Group of Seven exhibition. It will be on display until March 7th. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night. Bye, Anna.
Bye, Victoria.